Hello and a warm welcome to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Vladimir Putin. What explains his popularity at home and the ceaseless interest in him from around the world? For many, he's a great leader of our time, though others are much less generous in their assessment. To discuss this and much more, I'm joined by John Ray. He's a diplomatic correspondent for ITN. We also have Tony Halpin. He's a journalist and former Moscow bureau chief for The Times. And sitting next to me here in Moscow in Voice of Russia's studio is Mark Sloboda. He's a senior lecturer and researcher at the International Relations Department of Moscow State University. All right, Mark, if I can go to you first here in Moscow, explain to me, Vladimir Putin has consistently had very high poll numbers that are, 62% now. They've been higher, but 62% is pretty high.
Yes, 62% was the latest reading just this month from one of the major Russia polling agencies. This continues a strain since his re-election a year ago, where his approval rating has varied between 62 and 65%, which is within the margin of error of any poll, essentially rock solid. This was also the amount that he won the election by and what he pulled at before the election. So we see a quite remarkable consistency in Putin's approval rating, despite a slight economic downturn. Russia's economy has dropped along with the rest of the global economy.
Tony, you lived for many, many years in Moscow. I knew you as a correspondent here for The Times. Vladimir Putin's popularity, how do you explain it?
Well, I think initially it has to be said that in comparison to his immediate predecessor and Soviet predecessors, he has the benefit of appearing competent, having the qualities of what Russians call a mujik. He looks like a real man who makes decisions. He's a tough guy. And he's brought order and stability, which was clearly lacking in the immediate aftermath of the Soviet collapse. Russians, it has to be said, ordinary Russians don't pay a great deal of attention to everyday politics. What they want to know really is there chaos or is there not? And clearly there is not. So why change something that appears at least not to impinge too deeply on their lives? It would be another question if you had a more demanding electorate that began to ask questions such as, where's all the money gone? Why are the roads so poor? Why do the health services provide such poor cover healthcare for much of the population? But those aren't the yardsticks that Russians are using. Russians are using a yardstick about order, about stability, and about a clear leader, and Vladimir Putin satisfies those criteria.
I agree completely with what we've heard so far from Mark and Tony. He isn't Boris Yeltsin. That's obviously true. But that was 13 years ago. That's pretty good staying power still to use that comparison. Also, there's a lot more stability than there was in the 1990s. That's a given. Nonetheless, I think Tony hits the nail on the head there. I've lived in Russia for 15 years, and I find it astounding that foreigners talk about politics in Russia more than most Russians do. Weigh in there, John.
I was wondering what people in this country made of Vladimir Putin. And I think I'm just drawing a contrast. Tony was talking about his popularity in terms of his predecessors. And I remember when I was a younger man, we had a view of what was then the Soviet Union that was very much centered on the very powerful leaders that we had back in those days, the Brezhnevs that I remember well. And they sort of dominated a part of the sort of the Western consciousness in a way which Vladimir Putin might try to emulate but can't. I think if you ask most people in this country, most Westerners, what they think of Vladimir Putin, they will think, of course, of the slightly comic photographs of him stripped to the waist, his biceps flexed, wrestling various bits of wildlife or riding a horse. But is he part of our sort of daily thought about how the world is turning? And I don't think he is yet. I can't really speak about his popularity back in Moscow. I've not lived in Moscow. What I will say is that I think there is a very big strand of thought amongst diplomatic circles here that his very assertive foreign policy is in a way, a classic way, a cover for the cracks and the difficulties that every leader has back at home.
It's interesting. You've covered a lot of points in your statement there. Let's go back to the photo ops, Mark, because over the last 2 years, and Tony me, I'm not going to try to step on your toes here, but a lot of Western journos based in Moscow just love to write stories that denigrate Putin for his PR stunts. And I think from Western eyes that, yeah, sometimes I would roll my eyebrows too and say, well, that's kind of an interesting approach. But most Russians like that because they like to see a leader that is active, that, again, going back to the Brezhnev, going back to the Yeltsin years, this is a president that is active, that he's responsive, or at least gives the perception that he's active and responsive.
Well, I don't really quite understand the Western journalists' constant criticism of Putin's photo ops. I mean, every president does photo ops as a matter of business. Putin's choice of photo ops appeals to the Russian people, the values, the character that appeals to them. I also find it interesting that they continually harp on what can only be characterized as Putin's outstanding concern for nature and the environment, perhaps not quite in the terms of a Western green, but certainly in the terms of a Teddy Roosevelt conservative conservationist. He has again and again demonstrated that perhaps more than any president in the world other than Morales, he is the president that is routinely concerned most about endangered species and the environment. But I think the most important point of Putin's popularity in Russia was missed earlier. Law and order is a big part of this. And the return of Russia under his helm as a great power in the world, a country to be respected, is a major part of that.
Well, Mark, this is important. And Tony, if I can go to you, because we heard from John, being assertive or reasserting Russia on the global stage. I'm not as fascinated with that interpretation because I think it's more inverse. I think we see weakness in the West, weakness in Tony Blair, and from where I'm sitting here in Moscow, weakness in Mr. Cameron and other Western leaders. It doesn't mean that Russia and Putin is assertive. It's just that the other side, if we can call it the other side, is not as assertive or not as clear. Putin sends a clear message, if you like him or not.
Well, I think I'd have to take issue there. I think Russia in recent years has been losing friends rather than gaining them, and this has caused Mr. Putin to assert a Russia message ever more vigorously to make up for the fact that he lacks people and lacks allies wishing to make the same arguments. So I think you can mistake noise for strength, and we've certainly had a lot of noise from Russia in relation to its neighbours. But if you take the European neighbours, for example, most of those still look towards Europe for their future relationships, both economic and political. If you go to the Middle East, it was certainly the case, and I think it was to be much recognised by the world that Russia played a very good hand in Syria. But how much of that was really an assertion of Russia playing?
A weekend in Washington.
Well, yes,
yeah,
I think there was a weekend. I think it was a weekend in Washington, but that doesn't necessarily mean that Russia will end up advancing its interests ahead of anybody else's in the world.
I think that it's John here. If I could just jump in there, I think that's exactly right. I think Russia feels threatened by the eastward move of the European Union, but then suddenly it sees a banking crisis, which has questioned the whole model of Western capitalism, to use an old-fashioned phrase. It sees the euro in crisis. It sees the European institutions at sixes and sevens and questioned by members of states, and it sees an opportunity there. Similarly, as Tony's just pointed out, in the Middle East, it saw America ready for military action, and then it saw the parliament in this country, in Britain, vote against it, and then it saw, crucially, President Obama blink to show his reluctance, his weakness, perhaps. And I think that was the opportunity to move in. But I think overall, Putin is playing a defensive game in all this. It's not about expanding Russian influence. It's about defending a diminishing influence.
You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Mark, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I don't think that there's any question that Russia has vastly reduced geopolitical horizons from the Soviet Union. Russia is not the Soviet Union. It doesn't have the global ideological cause. It doesn't have communist allies in countries around the world. But that is the only way that we can view Russia as having lost allies or having decreased in influence when it's compared the Putin administration to the Soviet Union. When we compare it to the Yeltsin administration, we see exact opposite, I think. Perhaps Putin has lost allies in terms of the West and from the Western perspective in the last few years. But for the rest of the world, Russia has vastly increased relations.
You're speaking like in terms of the BRICS countries.
The BRICS countries, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a cooperation with South America, even inroads into Africa, vastly increased influence in the Middle East, now in Egypt, in Syria, in Iran, from what existed just years previously. So I don't think at all we can view Russia as a defensive power, losing influence, only perhaps in the public perception of the West and Western journalists. But the reality is Russia has become one of the leading powers of the world again, and countries around the world look to Russia to provide a
Tony, if I can
counterpoint.
go to you, if we agree with Mark, and I don't know if you do, but I mean, I think what Mark's getting at is that we're seeing this kind of paradigm shift of what influence and power means, and this is what Putin's agenda is, because, again, like him or dislike him, Foreign Minister Lavrov, he used international law and diplomacy to help Mr. Obama out in the region and the world when it comes to Syria. And that's not the kind of perception that Putin usually gets in Western media and in Western capitals, is leading a country that puts international law first and diplomacy first, unlike NATO and what's been going on in the United States for the last 10 years in its foreign policy.
Well, I mean, we should say Lavrov is a superlative diplomat, and he played a hand that had limited options extremely well. But if you come back to a bigger point, if I take up Mark's point about Russia forging new relationships with China and India and the BRICS countries, it's certainly the case that there are competing visions in international relations right now. There are those who base their views on values, shared values, and there are those who base their views on national interest in the world. I think it's fair to say that Putin asserts national interest, but that in the end has very limited appeal in a global world, because there are shared values which attract more adherents than there are those who are willing to assert, for example, Russia's national values. Only Russia is willing to do that.
Yeah, that's opposed to what values? Interventionist values?
Well, there could be values.
I mean,
you could make an argument
what
about
I'm saying is that if you look outside of Western capitals, particularly, then you will see that a lot of people, particularly in the Middle East today, will see values as something that the United States supports military interventions around the Arab world. That's not a value that is probably very much liked on the ground. I'm not trying to quibble with you here, but I mean, again, it's assuming that Western values are superior as opposed to actions on the ground. Russia doesn't go around invading countries. So you see what I'm getting at?
I think I'm just acknowledging that Putin views his national interest within limited terms. So it doesn't mean that he thinks that an assertion of Russian values or Russian interests abroad is a good idea. He prefers to defend his values and his interests against those who he perceives encroach upon them. But that does lead you into some strange cul-de-sacs, because if we take your Middle Eastern example, Putin looks like he's simply defending the right of autocrats to be autocrats forever. Now, that may not be the case, but that's how it's perceived around the world.
Even a non-intervention in Syria is an intervention. By not intervening, by blocking intervention in Syria, Russia changed the course of what is happening in that country for good or for ill.
Mark?
I think it's more a question of which autocrats different countries are supporting, because while Russia certainly supports the autocrat in Syria and is showing support for the military junta in Egypt, it is the United States and the West that supports the bloody autocrats in Qatar, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, and so on. So this perceived value gap.
All right, gentlemen, I don't want to go down this path here. I want to keep it on the image and perception of Vladimir Putin. Tony, it's very interesting to me over the last few weeks, particularly, and we don't have to talk about the nuances of the Syrian crisis and the negotiations there. But Putin got a little bit of a renaissance in international media. If he's a badass's badass, people like that. I mean, even Fox News in the United States was saying, well, at least here's a man with integrity. Here's a guy with guts. You see what I'm getting at? I mean, it's almost this image. It can be devoid of particular political meaning, but it's the perception that people really grabbed onto. Go ahead, Tony.
Yes, I think many internationally who hadn't had such a close-up view of Mr. Putin for some time, came to the conclusion that he's a man who says what he thinks and thinks what he says, and that's the view that many Russians have of him, and that's part of his domestic appeal. He's a very plain-speaking and blunt man. If I could just pick up one point, though, about his popularity internally. If I said, as I did at the beginning, that for many Russians he represents stability and they don't have very many higher demands of him than that. In Moscow, that's not the case, because it's a city where many people already have the basic essentials of life. And in Moscow, he's much less popular than he is in the country at large. In fact, one could argue that he lives in a hostile capital because a minority supported him in the presidential election. It does rather depend on which Russian you're looking at as to how popular Mr. Putin is.
Mark, you want to get
Putin's approval rating in the capital right now is 60%, just 2 points lower than in the rest of the country. So I'm not quite sure.
In the election, when people were presented with a real choice, he got a minority of the votes.
Yeah, guys, don't fall into the old lazy Western trap of thinking of Russia as a great big monolithic state where everybody thinks the same thing. There are many different opinions, of course.
I think John's reading my mind here. Thank you for saying that, John. One thing I would agree with Tony is that I wouldn't say that Vladimir Putin is unpopular in Moscow. He's less popular in Moscow than he is in other parts of the country. Yes, you're absolutely right. And there are other small groups that are mobilized and have the resources to do that. That doesn't necessarily, my reading of it is here, maybe Mark can give the poll numbers, but I wouldn't call it a hostile city, though he certainly has to keep an eye on what's going on in Moscow because it's the most important city in Russia in every single way.
I think the case of Moscow and Putin is exactly the case of the rest of the country and Putin. If we can quote a U.S. President Bill Clinton a few years ago, it's the economy, stupid. And the number one reasons why Russia's support President Putin is because what he's done with the economy since 1992. Russia's GDP has increased tenfold in the last decade. Russia has overtaken Germany as the fifth largest economy in terms of purchasing power parity, according to the latest World Bank ranking. Poverty has decreased from 2000 by 65% to just 11.2%.
Okay, Mark, you're good with the numbers. I want to go back to Tony here, because Tony and I used to sit at Kievsky Vokzal in Starbucks. Tony will remember this here. And I think what we both, with having so many disagreements on many different things, I think one thing that we both agreed on almost all the time is this perception of rising expectations. Because as was just pointed out, Tony was saying, is that a lot of people in Moscow do have what they want, and now they want even more. What I'm getting at, going back to Tony here, this is the challenge for Putin's popularity moving forward, because they need a new growth model to keep this economy going. Because as I started out, my first words after the introduction is the economy is no longer growing. It is on flatlining right now. This is a huge challenge for Mr. Putin, because for the last 12 years, he's been able to do differently. Tony.
Yeah, I think that's very fair. If the economy as a whole doesn't grow at quite the pace it has in the last decade or so, then people will begin to notice that, particularly in Moscow. Most Muscovites, I think, are busy getting on with their lives. They see a way for them to earn a living that meets their expectations and rising expectations. When that becomes no longer true, they'll begin to cast around for reasons why. So it's important for Mr. Putin, if he wishes to retain his popularity, that he figures out a way to restore growth. And there are elements around, if you call them the liberal elements around Dmitry Medvedev, the Prime Minister, who argue that the way to do that is to liberalize the economy. It's certainly the case that, liberalization in one part of life brings demands for liberalization in another. Muscovites and young Russians in general, I think, are well used now to exercising choice in every part of their personal lives and see no reason why they shouldn't in the political life.
It's John here. We are sitting here in a city, London, where we see around us the fruits of Russia's incredible economic expansion. You only have to try buy a house in this city to find out that the scion of some Russian oligarch has got there before you and gazumped you. There's a good English word, outbid you for it. But look, the classic criticism levelled by liberal economic theorists that the Putin is this, that he has absolutely squandered the golden legacy of sky-high oil and gas prices by failing to transform that into a pluralistic economy. And
well, I think that's a very simplistic way of looking at things. It
may be simplistic, but
it's very simplistic. Gentlemen,
true?
Let me jump in here. You're listening to Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Mark, react to that. Because I think, again, if you look at the 80s and the 90s and the 2000s, we're looking at different countries completely. A huge transformation on a scale that most countries... I mean, the last time we had something like this happen in the United States was the 1930s and then into the Second World War, of such a massive transformation. And it was done relatively peacefully and in a lot of prosperity, too. There are enormous economic challenges right now, and it's just not about Russia. It's global as well, okay? Yeah. But nonetheless, I mean, to use the same kind of benchmarks for everywhere else, it doesn't cut a lot of reasoning for me, because I don't see that kind of discontent here.
Yeah, I think everything has to be kept in a global context in terms of an interconnected global economy now, because Russia's growth may have just now flatlined, but it is still outperforming much of Europe. The United States continues to have economic and obviously political problems, most recently exhibited. The entire world economy is down, and to take Russia outside of that context, I think is really not helpful in any discussion of Putin's popularity. As for the oil and gas, it's only 14 to 17% of the GDP and going down every year.
And a lot of the money's been saved, John. A lot of money has been saved and put into coffers for a rainy day. They learned that in 2008.
It paid off all of Russia's international debt, while the U.S. and the West are all mired in simply enormous international and domestic debt. Russia has negligible debt and the fourth largest currency reserves in the world. So I don't really see
All right,
that.
gentlemen, I want to switch gears here because I want to keep it on Mr. Putin here. Tony, if I can go to you. Mr. Putin is in his third term as Russian president. This term is going to be 6 years in length. He may or may not run for election after that, which he can under the Constitution. What do you think, Tony? He's starting to think about legacy?
I actually think he is. If you look at the last 18 months and just set aside all the discussion around the opposition activities and everything else, my view of it is that it's mainly characterized by drift. You know, he came into power, he regained power, but that seemed to be the sole objective of his return. He didn't really seem to have a plan to know what to do with power domestically, at least. He has some foreign agenda which may or may not be successful. Will he last another 5 years with drift? I really doubt it. And certainly those around him in the Kremlin, I think, would not tolerate the prospect of a fourth term with drift. But Putin's very perceptive. I mean, I don't think he needs to be told when it's time to go, because he'll know it before anybody else does. The question I think that really confronts him is who to hand over to, because I think he won't let go of the reins of power until he's absolutely sure that legacy exists and won't be overcome by chaos as soon as he steps away.
Well, while Putin does have an extremely strong foreign policy agenda dedicated to the development of a multipolar world order and a growing voice for the developing the BRICS countries in the world, I can't see at all that his domestic policy can be characterized as drift. Putin, most recently at the Lavelle conference, made very clear his domestic agenda is the question of Russian identity. And this is always an eternal question in Russia, but Russia is trying to cement a popular, national, conservative, traditionalist identity for Russia. Part of his great appeal, other than the law and order and economics aspects of his presidency. And it is this identity that he's trying to cement before he leaves office, be it now or be it after another 6-year term that he's trying.
You know, John, if you were in President Putin's shoes right now, what kind of legacy do you think he wants to leave behind? Because he, for better or worse, and like I said at the beginning of the program, there's a lot of very strong opinions either way about Putin, but he is a character to reckon with. What do you think he wants to leave behind?
Well, he certainly will leave an impression. But let me give you a view from sort of diplomatic circles here.
Okay.
I think there is beginning to be a concern about the succession issue. We know he's got several more years, but I think there is a concern about what comes after Putin, and crucially whether the sort of model, this sort of vertically integrated model that Putin has pretty successfully run for a decade or more, whether that survives. The West, like everyone else, craves stability and from Russia. It is a major player on the world scene. But just at the moment, if you're in the British government, what you're mostly concerned about is not talking about politics or environment or Syria or any of those things. You're really just interested in doing business with Russia at the moment. It's a commercial interest. And as you've pointed out at that end of the conversation, such are the size and scale of the economic problems that we have to tackle here, then what we're looking for in Russia really is, I think, a commercial partner, somebody we can do business with. And we want some political stability behind that. And therefore the concern about what happens when Putin finally does decide to
I
finish.
think it's a very good point, because in the entire time, and again, just sitting with Tony having Starbucks coffee, we've talked, Tony, a number of times about institutional reform, and I'm looking at political parties. They still don't have much traction in Russia after all this time. And succession, who's going to come next? Because, whoever comes after Putin is going to have such huge shoes to fill. And we've seen this around the world with different countries, but this is something that eventually is going to happen here.
Yes, I think the thing that doesn't exist in Russia is the channel by which a challenger can campaign for power to the public rather than to the Kremlin apparatchiks and win popularity on the basis of the things that he or she promises to do. Any attempt to do that is characterized immediately as a sort of them and us situation by the Kremlin, and those in power seek to simply crush those who want to suggest alternatives. It would be better and healthier for Russian politics if there was this plurality, but so far it's not developing.
Mark, react.
If Putin does decide to step down in the next few years, there's three figures that talk centers around Shoigu, the defense minister, Rogozin, and Sergei Ivanov, who would be my choice. But I think very interesting, and when we're talking about popularity, is the sudden divergence between Putin and Medvedev's popularity, where Medvedev's popularity is now below 50%, and there's a 15% gap for the first time, showing that this Western liberalizing reforms, appeals to the West that Medvedev made are increasingly unpopular with the Russian people.
Well, that's very interesting because John and Tony, jump in now, either one of you. This is one of the things I found very interesting is the juxtaposition to the popularity of Vladimir Putin is we have former President Medvedev, and he was the quote-unquote favorite for so long in Western circles, and it didn't work out very well. And his appeal among Russians, I mean, most Russians I know even say, is he still there? He's still there? Is he still prime minister? Because he didn't make a mark. Tony.
Well, I think his credibility was shot as soon as he stepped aside for Vladimir Putin to return. And when he acknowledged on television to Russians that they'd planned that all along, I think many people who had some hopes in him as a reformer felt deeply betrayed. I think it's very difficult for any politician to come back from that.
I can only echo that. I mean, it may be more apparent from where you are who potential successors are. It's not apparent to the casual observer or even the practiced observer from this end. And, what we've seen most recently are those who dare to try to build a base of popular support wind up in trouble with the law. So, nor do I think that people. Can I just re-emphasize? I do not think that Britain particularly wants to lecture Russia on democracy, and I think we also acknowledge that post breakup of Soviet Union, some of the advice about liberalising the economy probably wasn't very wise.
Mark,
I think if we're going to head towards closing, I'd just like to compare Putin's popularity with popularity of other leaders in the world, with 44% for President Obama, 30-some% for Prime Minister Cameron, 23% for Holland. Putin is still incredibly popular in Russia, one of the most popular leaders.
Mark, let me ask
history.
you, one thing I think our listeners should get some kind of insight on is Russians like authority. They like authority figures. Let's keep that in mind.
I think all countries like authority figures. I don't think any country likes a weak president. Part of Obama's declining popularity and then Cameron's and Holland's, they're all characterized as weak presidents and prime ministers. So I can't think of a single country that likes weak presidents. But Putin has shown remarkable strength, and I think his legacy will go down as pretty much the savior of the country post-92.
Tony, as a historical figure, does Putin make history, or did history make him?
That's a very good point. I think he certainly does gain plaudits for restoring a sense of the state in Russia, because the state clearly was on the verge of collapse after the Soviet era and on the economic chaos that followed. And if you compare him, with 100 years of previous Russian rulers, he comes out looking pretty good. But those aren't the yardsticks that modern voters use. Modern voters want to know, what are you doing for me? And every politician has his sell-by date, and the trick for most politicians is to realize that their sell-by date is up before the voters do. Most politicians don't achieve that. It remains to be seen, I think, whether Putin does.
John Ray, Tony Halperin, and Mark Lavelle here in Moscow. Thank you for being with me on Voice of Russia's political discussion program, Debating Russia. I'm Peter Lavelle. Stay with VOR.